These slides are the ones that were presented right after the HPA Tech Retreat in February of 2014, but the audio was recorded later. So, is nothing new? Laser projection, high frame rate, glasses-free 3D, and other blasts from the past. Now, when I did the blurb for this presentation in the program, I didn't think about restricting it to having no fiction and no unachieved proposals. So I put a few things in there that are fiction and unachieved, but I'll very clearly delineate those from the rest. Most of this is going to be no fiction and nothing unachieved. Let's take electric cars, for example. They seem to be something brand new. On the left, I have an image of a Tesla electric car in 2014. And on the right, I have an image of Tesla and an electric car in 1893. In fact, in 1897, all New York City taxis were electric. So electric cars are not exactly something new. How about in our business? The answer to quiz number 4 was the execution of Mary Stuart in 1895. Now imagine this, you've never seen a movie before. You are looking at this movie, The Execution of Mary Stuart, and down comes the executioner's blade and the head comes off, and wow, that's got to be something amazing. Here's a motion picture projector from 1720. It's not the earliest motion picture projector. There were earlier ones, and on the left is a slide of motion. You can see the hand coming down and doing the spanking. The light source for this projector was either a candle or an oil lamp, or in a lecture hall they might have backed it up to a window and used some mirrors to gather daylight and use that for the projection. And there were many other motion slides that could be used. You could see planets revolving around the sun, or all sorts of other things that could be cranked. You could see fountains, spouting water, various things. On the left is a Blu-ray disc, a modern disc that you can go out and buy that has motion images on it. At the right is a video disc of the sort that was made in the 1920s. And to the left of that video disc is a moving image of video that was recorded on one of those type of discs. The disc was recorded just the same way that a 78 RPM phonograph record might have been recorded. In 2014, we had our first laser projection session at the HPA Tech Retreat. So does that mean that laser projection is brand new? Well, not exactly. Ted Maiman, the guy who invented the laser, founded a company called Laser Video in 1972, and at the bottom right is what was going to be one of their products. It's a laser rear screen projector. Because it uses a laser dot, the optical path could be very highly folded, and just to the left of it is a picture that was shot off screen in 1974, so actually looks like something that could have been a product fairly quickly thereafter. Now, the Sochi Winter Olympic Games are taking place during the retreat, and they have 4K viewing areas, little rooms that you can go into to watch the games in 4K. Well, is this the first time that people went into rooms to watch the games in some new technology? Not exactly. The 1936 Berlin Olympic Games were shot with special cameras and lenses. There's one on the left there. It was called the Fernsehkanon, or a television cannon because of the shape of it. And next to it is a public television office where you could go to view. Now, you might have viewed with a video projector, which is in the third image there, or you might have viewed on a flat panel display. This is an actual off-screen photo of a flat panel display that had been developed around that time, and you can see from the chair the size of the image. And resolution increased just as today. There were discussions of resolution increase back then. So in 1928, at the equivalent of the Consumer Electronics Show, there was a 30-line image on the left side and a 96-line image on the right side. And for the Olympic Games in 1936, they went all the way up to 180 lines. So we're definitely talking high-definition images. How about other large flat panel displays, but this time in color? Well, in 1910, the Rice Electric Display Company erected what it called the Leaders of the World chariot race atop a building in New York on Broadway. And the chariot race was full color, lasted about 30 seconds at 42 frames per second, considerably higher than today's movies at 24. By the way, Thomas Edison, when he first started doing motion pictures, did them at 46 frames per second. So very, very close to the 48 that has been used in the Hobbit movies. But back to this chariot race, it was 100 feet wide, it was 72 feet high, so we're talking IMAX type dimensions there. It had a 600 horsepower motor and more than 95 miles of wire and its own police unit for crowd control. And what killed it? Well, it was a building. In typical New York fashion, somebody built a building in front of it and nobody could see it anymore. Below the sign was a building called Telharmonic Hall, and it had a music synthesizer in it. There was called the Telharmonium. The version that came out in 1897 weighed 7 tons. The version that was in Telharmonic Hall in 1906 weighed 200 tons. The reason it weighed so much was that each note had its own alternator, so there was a tremendous amount of power being created in this synthesizer, and the intention was to deliver music to restaurants by wire, and that actually worked very well, and the restaurants were very pleased with the music that was coming in. But the high current that was carried in those wires induced music in all the other telephone lines, so that was not so well appreciated, and New York Telephone said that they had to stop it, and so an agreement was made with Lee DeForest, who was a radio pioneer, to transmit the music over wireless by 1907, but then the U.S. Navy complained that it was interfering with their wireless transmissions. Digital animation, well, starting in 1913, we had the luminograph and then the epoch and the wonder sign, and eventually these were in full color. At the right, you can see someone punching the holes in the digital animation system, but in addition to having this punch tape that could be used for playback of the digital animation, you could also project film and have it come up on one of these light bulb screens, or you could have live action, and this was done without a camera. What they did was had a wall of photocells, and each photocell controlled a light bulb, initially by relays and later by tubes, and the film could be projected onto the photocells, or if there were live dancers, they would just turn on lights and the dancers would dance in front of the photocells, and their images would be seen in Times Square on one of these lighted displays. Large screen television, well, here's a poster for SCOPHONY, a British company, and they're saying large screen means real television, so maybe a 6-foot image. And at the right, I have an image from one of the earliest of what we would today call HDTV demonstrations. This was at NHK's Science Technology Research Laboratory, and this was in 1969. How about smaller flat panel displays? Well, at the upper left here is a display that was television display shown by Bell Labs in 1927. In front of it is Herbert Ives, and it is a nice flat panel display in terms of the actual display part, but the bottom right shows what it looked like behind the display. And there were even earlier matrix cameras and displays. Here is something that appeared in English Mechanic and World of Science in the February 7th, 1879 issue. This is from Dennis Redmond of Dublin, and he's talking about a camera that he's built that's basically a flat matrix, kind of like a chip camera today, and a display that's also a flat matrix. And he actually says he's succeeded in transmitting built-up images of very simple luminous objects. How about watching video on a handheld device? Well, we discussed at the Tech Retreat in 2005 the mobisodes of 24 Conspiracy, which had to be only 1 minute long, because how long do you want to hold your phone up to your eye? And had louder shots and larger bullet holes and extra blood. And then we have a Panasonic little TV, easily hand-holdable. You can see the pen in front of it. Below that is the Sinclair Microvision. And what was especially wonderful about it was that it worked worldwide under any standards. You could adjust the type of modulation and separation of picture and sound carriers and so on. And even those aren't the earliest. At the top right is an image of the 1959 Philco Safari. Maybe not quite handheld, but easily towable to the beach where you could watch television. That's why it's got that sunshade on it. How about information delivery to homes? Well, we have teletext in 1972, home fax prior to 1940, and the reason I say prior to 1940 is that picture is from a brochure that was delivered in 1940, and then at the right a poster for a system in Budapest that delivered news and entertainment by telephone line starting in 1893 and continuing into World War II, when its telephone lines were bombed and it didn't seem to be worth fixing them because there was radio by that point. But it had the first newscasts and the first broadcast schedules. You could find out what was on later that night. These things were printed and delivered. And sportscasts, even earlier, beginning in 1884. Here's from an article called Baseball by Electricity that was in the Detroit Free Press in 1886, and it shows the evolution of sportscast language. So we have foul fly to left. The audience fairly held its breath, and when the next instant the operator called out, and out to white, there came a storm of applause, just such as is heard on a veritable ball field. Now, how about second screen distraction issues? This is a picture that was shown by Sarah Pearson last year in her wonderful discussion of how people actually watch television. And here we see the woman of the couple, and she is looking at her laptop, but what she's actually looking at is a sporting event while a sporting event is happening on screen. Well, is this something new? I don't think so. Maybe we should call it second source instead of second screen distraction issues. But again, there's the woman of the household, and she's got her source of distraction in her lap. It's a newspaper. And I don't know, maybe she is watching the sports section while everyone else in the family is watching TV. What about if not everyone wants the same program? Well, here's something Samsung introduced last year, an OLED TV that has 3D glasses, and you can have two different programs on, and one person can be watching one program and another person can be watching the other program, both of them wearing glasses. Is that something new? Well, no. Here is the Dumont duoscopic TV as depicted in Popular Science in 1954. And you can see the people are wearing glasses, and they're also showing earphones, because how else are you going to deal with the two different sound programs? But they're watching the same TV with two programs at once, and the inset is showing how that worked. Was this just an idea? No. Here is a dealership, and there's the promotional duoscopic glasses hanging in front of the duoscopic TV, and then other TVs on either side of it. How about viewing goggles? Well, there's some ITV viewing goggles on the left from 2010, and there's Hugo Gernsback in 1963 wearing his viewing goggles. Now, I trimmed the picture a bit so you don't see the full extent of the rabbit ears that he's wearing. This is related to the first photographic motion picture patent, which was in 1852, and by the way, it was in 3D. Now, the patent was issued to Jules Dubosc, and he called his system a bioscope, and bioscope discs exist. The one that's pictured here is from the University of Ghent. Unfortunately, even though we have the patent and we have the existing disc, we don't know exactly how it worked, but it was a French patent, and French patents at that time required that you had to go to some important person from a significant institution who had to verify that your system worked. So he was able to make it work, but we don't know at the moment how. But how about 3D without glasses? Here's something that appeared in Modern Mechanics in 1931, showing how a photocell scanner could be synchronized to an image drum, and you could see 3D in front of you and not have to wear any glasses. That's at home. How about in a cinema? Well, here's glasses-free cinema, stereoscopic 3D. At the left is the stereo kino in Moscow. At the right is the stereo kino in St. Petersburg. And in the middle, you can see the parallax bars being applied to the screen at the Moscow stereo kino in 1940. And you could sit in your seat and watch 3D movies. And there was actually quite a number of them that came out. How about earlier? Well, here's the 1900 Paris World's Fair. This is the Trans-Siberian Express ride, and it was actually created by the same company that ran the Trans-Siberian Express. And in the bottom right image, you can see that the people got into a fake train. They looked out of their windows, and what they saw was a number of different bands, and the bands would move at different speeds. So things that were close to the train would move faster than things that were farther from the train, and based on the motion parallax, you got a 3D sensation. Now, that 1900 Paris World's Fair had a lot of other things. We heard yesterday from Frédéric Lumière about the system that he came up with in Arromanches for a 360-degree view of the Normandy invasion, D-Day. And here is something at the Paris World's Fair called the Cinéorama. I think that the system in Arromanches had a similar kind of name. And people could see what it was like to be in a balloon ride. Unfortunately, the Paris Fire Department decided that this was a fire hazard, and they closed it before any of the actual fairgoers could go in and see it, but some people experienced it before it closed. Some more at the 1900 Paris World's Fair. At the left was the Mariorama, which was a motion platform simulator, so you could get on a ship and get seasick. And at the right, a poster for the Phono-Cinema Théâtre, which was one of 3 synchronized sound movie theaters that were at the 1900 World's Fair, and there were even earlier sync sound movies demoed. I've shown one from 1894 at previous retreats. And even more at the fair. At the left is large format shooting. The Lumières used 60 millimeter film, and then they had a giant screen. Initially it was 24 meters by 30 meters and viewable on both sides. The Paris Fire Department again would wet down the screen to make it translucent. And even more at the fair. Let's not forget sound. At the left is an auxetophone, an acoustic broadcasting system, and that was brought to the top of the Eiffel Tower in Gustave Eiffel's office, and they played records, and it was so loud it used compressed air going through a grid that was controlled by the needle rather than the needle just controlling a diaphragm, that people down on the ground could hear the music that was being transmitted as they walked around. And then at the right is the telegraphone, which was the first magnetic recorder. It's a little bit older than the Paris World's Fair, but the oldest surviving magnetic recording that we know of was made at the Paris World's Fair. It was the Emperor Franz Joseph. So, talking about sound recording, we think that the earliest sound recordings were made by Thomas Edison with his phonograph in 1878 or maybe 1877. But actually there were much earlier recordings made. This is the phonautograph on the upper left, and it recorded what were called phonautograms, but it was a record-only system, or intended to be a record-only system, or a write-only memory. Edison's was intended to record and play back. But as technology marches on, we can do various things. So in 2008, we got good enough technology that at the Lawrence National Laboratory, they were able to play back the sounds from the phonautogram for the first time. And it's actually quite recognizable, the song Au clair de la lune. And they even know, based on a tuning fork that was used, exactly what the playback speed should be. So we know that it was a man singing and not a woman, and we can hear the sound of the singer. So which came first, recording or playback? Well, here is an automaton that was given to Marie Antoinette in 1784, and it looked like her, and that freaked her out, and so she gave it to the Academy of Sciences, which is why we have it today, why it wasn't destroyed. But these automata with music playback date back at least to 9th century Baghdad. So maybe we had playback before we had recording. Now, how about lip sync? Here are some recent headlines. One about a lip sync issue on the Grammy Awards television show, and the lower one, even more recent. It's this week from Time, talking about Britney Spears forgetting to lip sync during her Las Vegas show. But when did we have lip sync? Well, here is an example of lip sync in 1908. The singer is Enrico Caruso on a recording, and the actor is lip syncing to him.
La donna mobile, qual piuma al vento, sempre una mobilella da provviso, il fialto e il riso, mersagliero, la donna mobile, qual piuma al vento, mutava certo di pensier, di pensier.
And I like how the actor drinks some water. It's sort of like a ventriloquist wants to show that it's actually him singing. So, how about stereo delivery? This was the first stereo sound delivery that we know about in 1881. Microphones in pairs at the Paris Opera delivered to the First International Electrical Congress. And there are images from two highly reputable journals, Scientific American on the left and Nature on the right. And Victor Hugo was one of the listeners, and he said, "The children were delighted, and I was too." But how about even earlier sound transmission? Well, there's a book that came out in 1665 by the scientist Robert Hooke called Micrographia, and that image of a flea is from the book. But in this book, Hooke says that he can assure the reader that he has, with the help of a distended wire, propagated sound to a very considerable distance in an instant. Now, in fact, he probably did have this happen in an instant because sound travels through solid things like wires much faster than it goes through air. And this is the famous image of President Nixon's secretary, Rosemary Wood, demonstrating how she somehow stretched and accidentally created the 18.5-minute Watergate gap. The reason I have this in here is to show that what follows is a stretch. I said I would very carefully delineate things that were not real from the things that were real, but still it's fun to look at the speculation. So here is something that appeared in The Sun, a newspaper in New York, in 1877, and the writer is describing something called the electroscope, and he seems to be describing alternative content for cinema. He says, both telephone and electroscope applied on a large scale would render it possible to represent at one time on 100 stages in various parts of the world the opera or play sung or acted in any given theater. We would say it was alternative cinema, except cinema hadn't been invented yet. How about the 24-hour news cycle? This is something that I've shown here before. This is Le Grand Pain, a continuous subscription newspaper in the French novel The World as It Shall Be, 1846. And people who subscribed to the newspaper would have a lot of rollers in their homes, so the newspaper would effectively slow down and you could read the news in there before it continued. People who didn't have the newspaper had to try to read it on the fly, as those people in the image are doing. And this followed closely on the invention of continuous roll wood pulp newsprint in 1844. How about war coverage in 1882. This is from Albert Robida's book, The 20th Century. There he has an image on a 16:9 monitor. I'll explain more about that in a moment. And on the right is the correspondent who's shooting the image. The camera is in his left hand, his microphone is in his right hand, and he must have a very long cable to get to the transmission point. But notice how the camel is appropriately labeled press so that people shouldn't fire at him, but they do anyway, and he gets wounded. But I'm giving away too much of the story. So there we have that 16:9 aspect ratio. What if that's not the right aspect ratio? Well, here is something that was published in 1878. It says on top Punch's Almanac for 1879, but it appeared in the December 9th, 1878 issue of Punch. And this has a 2.4:1 aspect ratio. And this was called Edison's Telephonoscope, and the writer was speculating about what Edison might have invented, but in fact it turns out that Edison did invent a true telephonoscope, also in 1878. This is from a patent caveat, that's Edison's own handwriting. But what was the telephonoscope? It was a dual ear trumpet that you could put on tripods and listen to sounds from very far away. And we didn't have just ordinary broadcast TV. You could watch the opera at home, as in the upper right, but you could also do distance learning, as just to the left of that, home shopping, and there was even voyeur vision, especially when there was a missed connection. And also that same novel, which is called The 20th Century by Albert Robida, 1882, introduced product placement in broadcast scripts. And now we have an image of Justin Bieber to indicate that we're getting back to reality. So here is an actual letter that was sent by Vice President of NBC to President Franklin Roosevelt in 1939 about things that are going to be on television. There wasn't any sort of newspaper TV guide or a magazine called TV Guide at the time, so the vice president of the television network would send a personal letter to the president to tell him what he could watch. And here he's saying that we're planning to send you these professional football games from the Polo Grounds. Then, unfortunately, he discusses an important New York problem. Our dilemma revolves around permission to park our nice big television trucks on property adjacent to the Polo Grounds in order that we could take you by television to these games on Sunday afternoon. The owner of the only available property is as vacillating as a weather vane. First he said we could park. Then he said we couldn't. He changed his mind 4 separate times. We offered to pay a stiff parking fee. We also offered to reimburse him for any damage to his property. Sad but true. He told us as far as our television trucks were concerned, he just didn't want any highfalutin contraptions around. We tried every argument we could think of to get the game to you, but in vain. So, instead of professional football on Sunday, December 3rd, we invite your attention to a series of unusual fencing matches. And finally, here is an image of a cable-laying ship, the Agamemnon, laying the first transatlantic cable in the 1850s. And you think you have problems? How about having a whale biting on your cable? That's an even bigger problem.